The hardest thing about losing someone is realizing they may have been the one person who truly understood you. Nathaniel Carter never expected a hospital phone call to reopen a chapter of his life he thought was already closed. 6 months had passed since his divorce from Emily Richardson. 6 months since two people who once promised forever signed papers that officially ended their marriage. To the world, Nathaniel was still the same man. The billionaire CEO of Carter Holdings. The man who appeared on magazine covers and made decisions that affected thousands of employees. His company was growing. His investments were successful. His schedule was always full. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But perfection had never felt so quiet. Late one evening, Nathaniel stood alone inside his office, looking through the glass walls at the city lights below. His phone rested on the desk beside him, surrounded by unfinished reports and unanswered messages. He had convinced himself that moving forward was the right choice, that the past belonged behind him. Then the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Mr. Carter?" a professional voice asked. Nathaniel picked up immediately. "Yes. My name is Dr. Rebecca Miller from Mercy Medical Center. I am calling about an emergency contact listed for a newborn patient." Nathaniel frowned. "A newborn patient?" "Yes. The mother listed you as the father." For a moment, the entire room became silent. Nathaniel looked at the phone as if the words had changed meaning. "I am sorry. Could you repeat that?" The doctor spoke gently. "The baby was admitted to the neonatal intensive care unit. The mother requested that we contact you." Nathaniel's mind searched for an explanation. A mistake. A misunderstanding. Something that made sense. But then he heard the name. Emily Richardson. His expression changed. Emily. The woman who had once been the center of his life. The woman he had not spoken to in months. The woman he thought he had lost forever. "That is impossible," Nathaniel whispered. The doctor paused. "Mr. Carter, I understand this is unexpected. But Emily is here, and the baby needs support." Nathaniel looked around his office. The expensive furniture. The awards on the wall. The reminders of everything he had built. Suddenly, none of it felt important. "I will be there," he said. The drive to Mercy Medical Center felt longer than any business trip he had ever taken. His thoughts moved faster than the city lights passing outside the car window. How could Emily have a baby? Why had she never told him? Had she tried? Had he missed something? Questions followed him all the way to the hospital entrance. When Nathaniel stepped inside, the familiar smell of the hospital brought back memories he did not expect. Moments with Emily. Conversations they never finished. The distance that slowly grew between them. He found the neonatal intensive care unit after speaking with the front desk. Through the glass, he saw several small beds surrounded by soft lights and careful attention. Then he saw her, Emily, sitting beside one of the tiny beds. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her face looked tired, but her expression was full of love. She was holding a newborn baby wrapped in a small blanket. Nathaniel stopped walking. For the first time in months, the woman he had tried to leave in the past was standing right in front of him. But she was no longer just his ex-wife. She was a mother. Emily looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened slightly. Neither of them spoke at first. There were too many emotions between them. Surprise. Confusion. Memories they had both tried to forget. Finally, Nathaniel whispered, "Emily." She looked at him quietly. "You came." Those two words affected him more than he expected. Because beneath everything that had happened between them, beneath the divorce and the silence, there was still something unfinished. He looked at the baby in her arms. A tiny life he knew nothing about. A child who had somehow connected their paths again. And in that moment, Nathaniel Carter realized something that changed everything. He had not come to the hospital to revisit the past. He had come because the future was waiting for him. The hospital room was quiet, but the silence between Nathaniel Carter and Emily Richardson felt heavier than any conversation they had ever shared. 6 months of distance. 6 months of unanswered questions. 6 months of trying to convince themselves that leaving was easier than staying. Yet one moment brought everything back. Emily looked at Nathaniel standing near the entrance of the NICU, and she saw the same man she once loved. But she also saw the person who was no longer part of her everyday life. "You should not have had to find out this way," Emily finally said. Her voice was calm, but there was emotion behind every word. Nathaniel looked at the baby in her arms. "Why did you not tell me?" It was the only question he could ask. Emily looked down at the newborn wrapped carefully in the blanket. "I tried." Nathaniel became still. What do you mean? She took a slow breath. I tried to reach you after I found out I was pregnant. The words surprised him. I never received anything. Emily looked at him. I know. That answer created more questions than it solved. Nathaniel stepped closer, but he stopped before reaching the bedside. He did not want to make the moment about himself. Not yet. Emily, I need to understand. She nodded. I know you do. Her eyes moved toward the baby. His name is Liam. Nathaniel repeated the name quietly. Liam. For the first time, the reality became something more than a hospital call. This was a child. A small person who had existed while Nathaniel was focused on everything else in his life. He looked through the glass at the tiny bed and felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not confusion. Something deeper. A sense of responsibility. How long has he been here? Nathaniel asked. A few days, Emily replied. The doctors are taking good care of him. Nathaniel noticed the way she spoke. She was tired. He could see it. But she was still focused on Liam before herself. That was the Emily he remembered. The person who always cared about others before her own needs. Why did you handle this alone? He asked softly. Emily looked at him for a moment. Because I did not know if you wanted to be part of this. Nathaniel felt those words more than he expected. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain. But he knew there was truth behind them. Their marriage had not ended because they stopped caring. It ended because they stopped understanding each other. He had spent too much time building Carter Holdings. He thought providing a successful life was the same as being present. He had been wrong. Emily, he said quietly, I wish I had known. She looked away. I wish things had been different too. For a moment, they stood together in the same room, but carried different memories. Nathaniel remembered the beginning of their relationship. The laughter, the plans, the moments before work became more important than everything else. Emily remembered the same things. But she also remembered feeling alone even when they were together. A nurse entered the room and gave them an update on Liam. His condition was being monitored carefully, and the doctors were hopeful. Nathaniel listened to every word. He asked questions. He wanted to understand. Emily noticed the change. This was not the distant CEO who spent every hour chasing another business goal. This was a man trying to learn how to be there. After the nurse left, Nathaniel looked at Emily. What do you need from me? The question surprised her. She expected an explanation. She expected a plan. She did not expect him to simply ask. Emily looked at Liam before answering. I need you to be honest. Nathaniel nodded. I will be. And I need you to understand that I am not asking for money. He looked at her. I know. She continued. Liam does not need a billionaire. He needs a father. Nathaniel felt the weight of those words. Because for the first time, he understood what he almost lost. Not a business opportunity. Not a reputation. A family. He looked at his son through the glass and quietly made a promise to himself. This time, he would not let success become the reason he missed what mattered most. And as Emily watched him standing there, she saw something she had not seen in a long time. Not the powerful CEO. Not the man everyone respected. Just Nathaniel. A father realizing he had been given a second chance. For the first time in months, Nathaniel Carter found himself sitting in a hospital chair with no idea what to say. The man who could negotiate billion-dollar agreements and lead an entire company through uncertainty felt completely unprepared in front of one small hospital bed. Because this was not a business decision. This was his son. After the nurse finished explaining Liam's condition, Nathaniel stayed near the NICU window, watching the tiny movements of the newborn. Every detail felt impossible to ignore. The small blanket. The quiet sounds from the machines. The careful attention from the medical team. It was a world completely different from the one Nathaniel knew. A world where success was not measured by numbers. It was measured by presence. Emily watched him silently. She noticed the way he looked at Liam. There was confusion in his expression, but there was also something else. A connection he could not explain. You look different, Emily said softly. Nathaniel turned toward her. Different? Yes. When you walked in, I expected the CEO. He looked at her carefully. And now? Emily looked back at Liam. Now I see someone trying to understand. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. Her words were honest, just like they had always been. That was one of the things he loved about her before everything became complicated. Emily never tried to impress him. She never cared about the power that came with his name. She cared about the person behind it. I should have been there, Nathaniel said quietly. Emily did not answer immediately. She knew what he meant. The missed conversations. The moments when work became more important. The times when she felt alone even though they were married. "Nathaniel," she finally said, "we cannot change what already happened." He looked at her. "I know, but we can decide what happens next." Those words stayed with him, because for the first time, Nathaniel realized this was not about fixing the past. It was about building something better from this moment forward. Later that day, Nathaniel returned to his office briefly. His assistant noticed something different immediately. The man who usually walked quickly through the building now moved slower. The man who always focused on the next meeting was checking his phone for updates from the hospital. "Are you going back?" she asked. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes. The board meeting is tomorrow." He looked at the schedule on his screen. Normally, he would have adjusted everything around the company. This time, he adjusted the company around what mattered. "Move it." His assistant was surprised. "The meeting?" Nathaniel nodded. Everything that can wait should wait. It was a small decision. But for Nathaniel, it represented a change he never expected. At the hospital, Emily sat beside Liam while Nathaniel returned. He carried no expensive gifts, no grand gestures, just himself. "I spoke with the doctor," he said. "I want to understand everything." Emily looked at him carefully. "You do not have to prove anything." Nathaniel nodded. "I know." He looked at Liam. "I just want to be here." Those words meant more than Emily expected. She had spent months preparing herself to raise Liam alone. She had learned how to be strong because she thought she had no other choice. Seeing Nathaniel take responsibility was something she never allowed herself to hope for. "Why now?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel looked at her. "Because I finally understand what I was missing." Emily stayed silent. "I thought providing everything was enough," he continued. "I thought building a successful life meant I was doing the right thing." He looked at Liam. "But I forgot that people do not remember what you bought them. They remember if you were there." Emily felt emotion rise inside her. Not because everything was suddenly perfect. It was not. There were still unanswered questions. There were still wounds from the past. But for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel was not running away from them. As evening arrived, the hospital lights reflected softly against the windows. Nathaniel sat beside Liam's bed, watching his son sleep. Emily sat nearby. They were not the same couple they had been before. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. But they were two people standing at the beginning of something new. And Nathaniel finally understood the truth he had avoided for too long. He had spent years building an empire. But the most important thing he had ever been given was not a company, a title, or a fortune. It was a chance to be a father. For years, Nathaniel Carter believed that difficult situations could be solved by finding the right answer. In business, every challenge had a strategy. Every problem had a solution. But standing beside his newborn son's hospital bed, he realized some moments could not be fixed with money, influence, or careful planning. Some moments required something much simpler. Presence. Emily Richardson noticed the change in him over the next several days. Nathaniel stayed at the hospital longer than she expected. He asked the doctors questions. He learned Liam's schedule. He listened carefully when the nurses explained every detail. He was not trying to prove himself. He was trying to understand. That was something Emily had not seen from him in a long time. One evening, Nathaniel sat beside Liam's NICU bed while Emily watched quietly from the nearby chair. The soft hospital lights reflected across the room, creating a calm moment after days of uncertainty. "You really do not have to stay every night," Emily said gently. Nathaniel looked at her. "I know." "Then why are you?" He looked at Liam before answering. "Because I missed enough already." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Nathaniel was not someone who usually admitted mistakes. He built an image around confidence and control. But here, with his son sleeping nearby, there was no image to protect. Only the truth. "I spent years thinking I was doing the right thing," he continued. "I thought working harder, building the company, creating financial security, that was how I showed people I cared." Emily listened quietly. "But I never stopped to ask if the people I loved actually felt loved." The words touched something inside her. Because that was the reason their marriage had slowly fallen apart. It was never about one single moment. It was about all the small moments when Emily felt like she was facing life alone. "Nathaniel," she said softly, "I never needed a perfect life." He looked at her. "I needed you to be there." He lowered his eyes. He knew she was right. After their divorce, he told himself they had simply grown apart. But now he understood the truth. Distance was not something that happened overnight. It was created through countless moments when people stopped reaching for each other. The next morning, Nathaniel received several messages from his company. Important meetings, business decisions, issues requiring his attention. He looked at the phone for a moment, then put it aside. Emily noticed. "You are not going back to work?" she asked. "I will handle what needs to be handled." She looked surprised. The old Nathaniel would have already left. He gave a small smile. The old Nathaniel made a lot of mistakes. It was the first time she heard him say that without defending himself. Later that day, Nathaniel met with the hospital team to discuss Liam's care. He wanted to understand everything, not because he was trying to control the situation, but because he wanted to become the father Liam deserved. Emily watched from the doorway. She remembered another version of Nathaniel, a man who always had somewhere else to be, a man who measured his days by accomplishments. The person standing in front of her now felt different. Not completely changed, not magically healed, but willing to try. That evening, they sat together after Liam fell asleep. The conversation was quieter than before. "Do you regret marrying me?" Nathaniel asked suddenly. Emily looked at him. It was not the question she expected. "No," she answered honestly. "I regret that we stopped understanding each other." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I do too." For the first time since the divorce, they were not arguing about the past. They were acknowledging it. And that made something feel possible. Outside the hospital window, the city continued moving. People were rushing to work. Businesses were opening. Lives were continuing. But inside that small room, two people who once lost their way were beginning to find a new direction. Nathaniel looked at Liam and felt a responsibility unlike anything he had experienced before. He had spent years building a legacy that carried his name. But now he understood that the greatest legacy was not something written on a building. It was something created in the hearts of the people who knew him. And for the first time, Nathaniel Carter was ready to become more than a billionaire. He was ready to become a father. After his first days beside Liam's hospital bed, Nathaniel Carter began seeing the past differently. For months, he believed his divorce from Emily Richardson was the result of two people simply growing apart. But now, sitting beside his newborn son, he started to understand that the distance between them had been created by moments they never talked about. Moments when both of them needed something but never knew how to ask. One quiet afternoon, Nathaniel found Emily sitting near the hospital window while Liam rested peacefully. The soft afternoon light filled the room, creating a calm moment after so much uncertainty. "Can I ask you something?" Nathaniel said. Emily looked up. "Of course." He hesitated. What was the hardest part about everything? Emily knew exactly what he meant. Not the hospital. Not the exhaustion. The years before. She looked at Liam before answering. "Feeling like I was facing everything alone." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. The answer was simple, but it carried the weight of many memories. He remembered the nights he stayed late at the office, the dinners he missed, the conversations he postponed because he believed there would always be more time. "I thought I was building a future for us," he said quietly. Emily looked at him. "I know you did." Her response surprised him. She was not angry. She was not trying to punish him. She was simply honest. But sometimes people can be working for a future while forgetting to live in the present. Nathaniel stayed silent because he knew she was right. For years, he had measured love through responsibility, providing, protecting, building security. But he had forgotten that love also required attention. It required showing up. "Why did you not tell me after the divorce was finalized?" he asked. Emily looked down. "Because I was not sure how you would react." Nathaniel looked surprised. "You thought I would not want to know?" She looked at him gently. "I thought you would think it was another responsibility you had to manage." Those words affected him more than he expected. Because deep down, he knew there was some truth in them. He had spent so much time managing his life that he sometimes forgot to experience it. Later that evening, Nathaniel spoke with his assistant and reviewed his schedule. The calendar that once controlled every minute of his life now looked different. He removed unnecessary meetings. He postponed business trips. He created space for something he had never scheduled before: being present. When he returned to the hospital, Emily noticed immediately. "You changed your schedule?" she asked. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes. Your company must need you." He smiled slightly. "My company has had me for years." He looked toward Liam. "My son needs me now." Emily looked away for a moment, hiding the emotion in her eyes. She had imagined many possibilities when Nathaniel found out. Anger, confusion, distance. She never expected this. Not perfection, not a complete solution, just effort. The next day, Nathaniel held Liam for the first time without hesitation. He sat carefully beside the small bed, watching every tiny movement. The experience felt overwhelming in a way no business achievement ever had. He had stood in front of thousands of employees. He had negotiated deals worth millions of dollars. But this moment made him feel more human than anything before. "He is so small," Nathaniel whispered. Emily smiled. "Yes." And somehow he changed everything. She looked at him. He already did. Over the following days, Nathaniel continued learning. He learned Liam's routines. He learned what questions to ask. He learned that being a father was not about having all the answers. It was about caring enough to keep trying. Emily watched the change slowly happen. She did not forget the past. She did not pretend the pain disappeared overnight. But she saw something she had not seen in a long time. Nathaniel was listening. That mattered. One evening, as they sat together near Liam's bed, Nathaniel spoke quietly. "I know I cannot erase what happened." Emily nodded. "No, you cannot. But I want to do better." She looked at him. "For Liam?" Nathaniel looked at their son. "For Liam. And because I should have done better for you too." The room became quiet. Not an uncomfortable silence. A peaceful one. A silence where two people who once lost each other began understanding each other again. Nathaniel thought he had lost Emily when their marriage ended. But now he realized something important. Sometimes people do not need the past restored. They need the chance to create something new. And beside a tiny hospital bed, a billionaire who once had everything was finally learning what mattered most. The days following Nathaniel Carter's decision to stay were different from anything he had experienced before. His life had always moved at a fast pace. Meetings followed by meetings. Decisions followed by decisions. Every hour had a purpose. Every minute had a value. But now, his most important moments happened in a quiet hospital room beside his newborn son. Nathaniel learned quickly that being a father was not about having perfect answers. It was about showing up. It was about noticing the small things. The way Liam moved his tiny fingers. The way Emily looked calmer when she knew she was not carrying everything alone. The way a simple presence could mean more than any expensive gift. Emily watched the changes carefully. She wanted to believe them. But part of her was still protecting herself. She had spent months preparing for a life without Nathaniel. She had learned how to make decisions alone, how to handle difficult days alone, how to protect her heart from disappointment. One evening, Nathaniel found Emily sitting beside Liam's bed after the doctors gave another positive update. He sat across from her quietly. "You know, I used to think I understood you," he said. Emily looked at him. "And now?" Nathaniel looked toward Liam. "Now I realize I only understood the parts of you I was willing to see." The honesty surprised her. Nathaniel had never been someone who easily admitted when he was wrong. "I spent so much time focusing on what I needed to accomplish," he continued. "I forgot that the people closest to me needed more than success." Emily looked down. "We both made mistakes." Nathaniel nodded. "Maybe, but I should have listened more." The conversation was different from the ones they had during their marriage. Back then, they were both trying to prove their own feelings were valid. Now, they were trying to understand each other. That change mattered. Over the next several days, Nathaniel became part of Liam's routine. He learned the small details Emily already knew. Which sounds helped calm him. Which moments required patience. Which questions to ask the medical team. He took notes. He listened. He learned. Emily noticed that he never acted like his money gave him special treatment. He never treated the hospital staff like employees. He thanked everyone who cared for Liam. He asked questions with respect. It reminded her of the person she first fell in love with. The person behind the title. One afternoon, Nathaniel received a call from his company. A major decision required his attention. Emily watched him step into the hallway. She expected him to leave. She expected the old Nathaniel to return. But a few minutes later, he came back. "Everything is handled," he said. Emily looked surprised. "You stayed?" Nathaniel smiled slightly. "Yes. That is new." He nodded. "I know." It was a small moment, but Emily felt its importance. Change was not proven through promises. It was proven through actions. Later that evening, Nathaniel sat beside Liam and looked at his son for a long time. "I missed so much already," he whispered. Emily heard him, but did not interrupt. She understood that some feelings needed space. After a moment, Nathaniel looked at her. "I cannot change the past." Emily nodded. "No, you cannot. But I want Liam to know his father was there." Her expression softened. "That matters." Nathaniel looked at her carefully. Does it matter to you too? Emily was quiet for a moment. The question carried more meaning than it seemed. She thought about the past, the hurt, the loneliness, the love that was still somewhere beneath everything. I do not know yet, she answered honestly. Nathaniel nodded. That is fair. He did not push. He did not demand forgiveness. For the first time, he understood that rebuilding trust was not something he could buy or rush. It had to be earned. As the evening continued, the hospital room became peaceful. Liam slept quietly. Emily rested in the chair nearby. Nathaniel stayed beside them. The three of them were not a perfect family. They were not pretending everything had been forgotten. But they were beginning something new. Nathaniel had once believed his greatest achievement was building Carter Holdings into a powerful company. Now he understood that the most important thing he could build was trust. And this time, he was willing to take every step necessary to earn it. As the days passed, Nathaniel Carter began discovering a side of fatherhood he never expected. He had spent years believing that responsibility meant providing everything people needed. A comfortable life, financial security, a successful future. But sitting beside Liam's small hospital bed taught him that responsibility was not only about what someone could give. It was about what someone was willing to be. Present, patient, available. Emily Richardson noticed every small change. She noticed how Nathaniel arrived early each morning. How he asked the nurses questions instead of assuming he already knew everything. How he stayed beside Liam even when there was nothing to do except sit quietly. The old Nathaniel would have struggled with that. He was always moving, always planning, always chasing the next achievement. But this Nathaniel was learning to slow down. One afternoon, Emily found him holding Liam carefully while reading through a small notebook filled with medical information. She smiled slightly. You made notes. Nathaniel looked up. I want to remember everything. Emily sat beside him. You know, you do not have to become perfect overnight. Nathaniel looked at her. I know. He paused. But I do want to become someone Liam can depend on. The sincerity in his voice touched her. She could see that this was not about proving something. It was not about repairing his public image. It was about a father trying to build a relationship with his son. Later that day, Nathaniel received a call from his company's leadership team. A major business decision needed his approval. Before, he would have immediately returned to his office. But this time, he looked at Liam sleeping peacefully and made a different choice. Send me the information, he said. I will review it tonight. His assistant sounded surprised. You are staying at the hospital? Nathaniel looked toward the room. Yes. It was a simple answer, but it represented a major change. For years, Carter Holdings had received his best attention. Now, his family was finally receiving it too. Emily watched from the doorway. She did not say anything, but she noticed. Actions were different from promises, and Nathaniel was finally showing actions. That evening, while Liam rested, Emily and Nathaniel talked about the past. Not to blame each other. Not to reopen old arguments. Just to understand. Do you remember when we first met? Nathaniel asked. Emily smiled softly. Yes. You were the only person who was not impressed by my job. She laughed quietly. Because I did not care about your job. I cared about you. Nathaniel looked down. That was exactly what he had forgotten. Somewhere along the way, he became so focused on being successful that he stopped being present as a person. I thought giving you everything meant I was loving you, he said. But I understand now that love is not only about giving things. Emily looked at him. It is about being there. He nodded. I should have understood that sooner. The conversation did not erase the past. Emily still remembered the loneliness. Nathaniel still carried regret. But something had changed. They were no longer two people defending their pain. They were two people trying to understand it. The next morning, Liam had a small improvement, and the doctors shared encouraging news. Nathaniel smiled in a way Emily had not seen in years. Not the confident smile from business meetings. A real one. A father's smile. He is stronger than I expected, Nathaniel said. Emily looked at Liam. He gets that from you. Nathaniel looked surprised. Me? She nodded. You built a company from nothing. You know how to keep going when things are difficult. He smiled slightly. I think he gets something from you too. Emily looked at him. What? The ability to care even when things are difficult. For a moment, they simply looked at their son. The child neither of them planned for at that moment in their lives had become the reason they were learning to understand each other again. Nathaniel once believed losing Emily was the end of their story. But now he realized some chapters do not end. They change. And sometimes, the thing that brings people back together is not a promise from the past. It is a new responsibility waiting in the future. The first time Nathaniel Carter held Liam in his arms, he understood that some moments could never be measured by success, wealth, or achievements. They could only be felt. The tiny weight of his son, the quiet sound of his breathing, the realization that this little person had existed while Nathaniel was focused on everything except what mattered most. As the days passed, Nathaniel continued learning what it meant to be a father. He did not rush the process. He did not assume his name or his money gave him an advantage. Instead, he listened. He learned. He showed up. Emily Richardson watched carefully from a distance. She wanted to believe that this version of Nathaniel was real. But trust was not rebuilt in a single day. It was created through small moments repeated over time. One morning, Nathaniel arrived at the hospital carrying a small bag. Emily looked curious. "What is that?" she asked. Nathaniel smiled. "A few things for Liam." She opened the bag and found simple items. A soft blanket. A small book. Nothing expensive. Nothing designed to impress. Just thoughtful things. Emily looked at him with surprise. "You chose these yourself?" Nathaniel nodded. "Yes." She smiled slightly. The old Nathaniel would have asked someone else to do it. He accepted the comment without becoming defensive. The old Nathaniel made a lot of mistakes. That honesty meant more than any apology. Because Emily did not need grand promises. She needed to see that he understood. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel and Emily sat together while Liam rested. They talked about the years they spent apart. Not with anger. Not with blame. With honesty. "I always thought you cared more about your company than me," Emily admitted. Nathaniel looked down. "Sometimes I think I cared so much about building a future that I forgot I was supposed to live in it." Emily stayed quiet. The sentence felt painfully familiar. "I did not need you to be perfect," she said. "I needed you to notice when I was struggling." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I should have noticed." There was no excuse in his voice. No attempt to explain it away. Just acceptance. That was something Emily never expected from him. The man she remembered always had a reason. A meeting. A responsibility. A goal. This man simply listened. A few days later, the doctors shared encouraging news about Liam's progress. Nathaniel felt a kind of happiness he had not experienced in years. It was not the excitement of closing a business deal. It was not the pride of seeing his company succeed. It was something quieter, deeper, a feeling of gratitude. "He is doing better," Nathaniel said softly. Emily smiled. "Yes, he is." Nathaniel looked at Liam. "I wish I had known about him sooner." Emily looked away for a moment. "I wish things had happened differently too." They both understood that wishing alone could not change the past. But they could choose what happened next. Outside the hospital, Nathaniel's world continued moving. Carter Holdings still needed leadership. Investors still expected decisions. But his priorities had changed. He began creating a schedule that allowed him to be present at the hospital while still managing his responsibilities. His employees noticed. The CEO who once seemed impossible to reach was now someone who understood balance. One evening, Nathaniel received a message from a colleague asking why he was making so many changes to his routine. His answer was simple. Because some things cannot be postponed. Emily heard about it later. She did not say anything at first. But inside, she recognized the importance of that choice. Nathaniel was no longer trying to prove he was a good person. He was simply becoming one through his actions. That night, as Liam slept peacefully, Nathaniel and Emily sat beside him. The room was quiet. "Do you think we can ever forgive everything?" Nathaniel asked. Emily looked at their son. "I think forgiveness is not forgetting." She paused. "It is choosing not to let the past decide everything." Nathaniel nodded. He understood. Their marriage had ended. That was true. The pain had happened. That was also true. But their story was not only about what they lost. It was also about what they could still build. As the hospital lights softened around them, Nathaniel looked at Emily and Liam. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about the next achievement. He was thinking about the people beside him. And he finally understood that the greatest success of his life would not be the empire he created. It would be the family he learned how to cherish. The relationship between Nathaniel Carter and Emily Richardson was changing in ways neither of them expected. They were not trying to rebuild their marriage overnight. They were not pretending the past had disappeared. They were simply learning how to stand in the same room again without carrying the weight of everything that had hurt them. And for the first time in a long time, They were choosing understanding over silence. As Liam continued improving, the hospital slowly became less about uncertainty and more about hope. Nathaniel noticed every small milestone. The first time Liam held his finger. The first time he reacted to his voice. The first quiet moments when Nathaniel realized he was becoming part of his son's life instead of just hearing about it. Emily watched those moments carefully. She saw the happiness on Nathaniel's face. It was not the expression of a CEO celebrating a business achievement. It was something more personal, something real. One evening, Nathaniel arrived at the hospital after a long day. Emily immediately noticed he looked tired. "Everything okay?" she asked. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, just a busy day." She smiled slightly. "You still have a company to run." Nathaniel looked at Liam. "Yes, but I am learning that my company is not the only thing that needs me." Emily did not answer, but the words stayed with her. Months ago, she never imagined hearing Nathaniel say something like that. Later that night, Nathaniel received a message from an old business partner asking him to attend an important event. It was something he would normally never miss. But when he looked at the time, he realized it conflicted with Liam's scheduled visit. He stared at the message for a moment. Then he declined the invitation. It was a small decision to the outside world. But to Nathaniel, it represented a completely different way of living. The next morning, Emily asked him about it. "You turned down that event?" Nathaniel nodded. "Yes. That was a big opportunity." He smiled softly. "So is this." He looked toward Liam. Emily felt something shift inside her. She remembered the Nathaniel she knew before. The man who always wanted to provide. The man who believed success could protect everyone he loved. But this version of him was learning something more important. Protection was not only about building a secure future. It was about being there while that future was happening. A few days later, Nathaniel and Emily had a conversation they had avoided for months. The topic was their divorce. Not the paperwork. Not the legal details. The emotions behind it. "Do you ever wonder if we gave up too soon?" Nathaniel asked. Emily was quiet. She thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes." Nathaniel looked at her. "But," she took a breath. "But I also think we needed to become different people." The answer surprised him. "Different people?" Emily nodded. "The people we were before were not ready for this." Nathaniel looked at Liam sleeping nearby. He understood what she meant. Their marriage had ended because they were both carrying things they did not know how to communicate. But now, they were learning. "I am sorry," Nathaniel said quietly. Emily looked at him. "For what?" "For making you feel alone when you should have felt supported." Those words were simple, but they meant more than a dramatic apology. Because Nathaniel was finally acknowledging the part he played. Emily looked down, feeling the emotion of the moment. "Thank you for saying that." They sat together in silence afterward. A peaceful silence. The kind that only comes when people finally stop fighting against the truth. That evening, Nathaniel stood by Liam's bed and watched his son sleep. He thought about the life he once imagined. A life built around achievements and success. Then he thought about the life in front of him now. A life that required patience, humility, and love. He realized something important. He had spent years trying to become a man everyone respected. But Liam did not need a billionaire. Emily did not need a powerful CEO. They needed Nathaniel. The person behind the title. The person willing to stay. And as the hospital lights reflected softly across the room, Nathaniel understood that redemption was not about changing the past. It was about proving, one choice at a time, that the future could be different. The biggest changes in Nathaniel Carter did not happen in boardrooms or during important business meetings. They happened in quiet moments that nobody else saw. A father sitting beside his son. A man admitting his mistakes. A person learning that love was not something proven through success, but through consistency. As Liam continued getting stronger, Nathaniel and Emily Richardson found themselves creating a new rhythm. They were no longer trying to return to the marriage they once had. They were building a different kind of relationship based on honesty and respect. Nathaniel understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. One day at a time. One choice at a time. At Carter Holdings, people began noticing the changes in their CEO. Nathaniel was still focused. Still determined. Still the person who guided the company through difficult decisions. But now there was something different about him. He listened more. He considered people before numbers. He understood that every employee had a life beyond their job title. During a leadership meeting, one executive asked why Nathaniel had changed his priorities so much. The company has always been your biggest responsibility, the executive said. Nathaniel looked around the room before answering. I used to think that was true. He paused. Now I understand that the people who matter most should never become something we handle only after everything else is finished. The room became quiet. His words surprised many people because they came from someone who had spent years putting achievement first. But Nathaniel meant every word. Later that week, Emily watched him spend time with Liam at the hospital. She noticed something she had not seen before. Nathaniel was not trying to be impressive. He was not trying to prove he was a good father. He was simply being one. You are getting better at this, Emily said softly. Nathaniel smiled. I still have a lot to learn. She nodded. That is actually a good thing. He looked at her curiously. Why? Because before, you always thought you already knew the answer. Nathaniel laughed quietly. That sounds accurate. Their conversation was different now. There was warmth where there used to be tension. Understanding where there used to be silence. They still had memories that hurt. They still had moments they needed to heal from. But they were no longer running away from them. One evening, Nathaniel received an invitation to attend a major business event. It was the kind of event that once would have been impossible for him to miss. Important investors. Important connections. Important opportunities. He looked at the invitation, then looked at the message from Emily saying Liam had reached another milestone. He smiled and declined the event. When his assistant asked why, Nathaniel simply replied, because I have somewhere more important to be. That choice would have seemed impossible to the old Nathaniel. But now it felt natural. At the hospital, Emily saw him arrive with a smile. She did not ask about the event. She already knew. You chose him, she said quietly. Nathaniel looked at Liam. I should have chosen him sooner. Emily felt the honesty behind those words. There was no excuse. No attempt to make the past sound different. Just acceptance. As the weeks continued, Liam grew stronger. The day finally came when the doctors shared news that they had all been waiting for. Soon, he would be able to leave the NICU. Nathaniel stood beside Emily, both of them looking through the glass at their son. A year ago, they never imagined they would be standing there together. Are you ready? Emily asked. Nathaniel smiled. I do not think anyone is ever completely ready. She laughed softly. That sounds like something a first-time father would say. He looked at her. Maybe I am finally becoming one. The moment was simple, but it carried everything they had been through. The mistakes, the distance, the regret, and the hope. Nathaniel once believed losing Emily meant losing the future he wanted. But he was beginning to understand something deeper. Sometimes life does not return things exactly as they were. Sometimes it gives people a chance to rebuild something stronger. And as Nathaniel held Liam for the first time outside the NICU, he knew one thing with certainty. The greatest achievement of his life would never be the company he created. It would be the family he finally learned how to cherish. When Nathaniel Carter walked out of the hospital with Liam for the first time, he felt a kind of happiness he had never experienced before. It was not the excitement of a major business achievement. It was not the satisfaction of reaching another professional goal. It was something quieter, something deeper. He was finally holding the part of his life he almost missed. The days after leaving the NICU were filled with moments Nathaniel once believed were ordinary. Feeding Liam, learning his routines, sitting beside him during peaceful afternoons. But to Nathaniel, every moment felt important. He understood now that life was not only made of big achievements. It was built from the small moments people choose to be present for. Emily Richardson watched Nathaniel carefully as they adjusted to this new chapter. She saw the effort. She saw the patience. She saw a man who was no longer trying to fix everything with money or influence. He was simply trying to be there. One evening, Nathaniel visited Emily and Liam at home. The house was quiet and warm. Nothing like the luxury spaces he was used to. But somehow, it felt more meaningful. Liam was sleeping peacefully nearby while Emily prepared a small meal in the kitchen. Nathaniel looked around and smiled. I forgot what a normal evening felt like. Emily looked at him. You used to have those. He nodded. I know. There was no defensiveness in his voice. Only understanding. They sat together after dinner, talking about things they had avoided for a long time. Their fears. Their mistakes. Their hopes. I want you to know something, Nathaniel said. Emily looked at him. What? I am not here because I feel guilty. She stayed quiet. I am here because I finally understand what matters. Emily looked down at her hands. That means a lot. Nathaniel continued. I know I cannot undo the moments I missed. I cannot change the person I was before, but I can decide who I become now. Emily looked at him carefully. Those words were different from promises he had made in the past. Before, Nathaniel often spoke about future plans, goals, success. Now he was talking about personal responsibility. That difference mattered. As weeks passed, Nathaniel became more involved in Liam's life. He attended appointments. He learned how to handle difficult nights. He celebrated every small improvement. His employees noticed the change too. The CEO, who once seemed impossible to reach, became someone who understood the importance of balance. During a company meeting, one executive asked Nathaniel about his new priorities. "You seem different lately," the executive said. Nathaniel smiled. "I am." "What changed?" Nathaniel thought for a moment. "I realized I was building a future while forgetting to live in the present." The answer stayed with everyone in the room. Because it was not just about business. It was about life. Meanwhile, Emily slowly began letting go of the fear she carried. She still remembered the loneliness. She still remembered feeling like she had to handle everything alone. But she also saw that Nathaniel was making a genuine effort. He was not asking her to forget. He was asking for the chance to prove he could be different. One afternoon, Emily found Nathaniel sitting with Liam, reading a small children's book. She smiled. "I never imagined seeing you do that." Nathaniel looked up. "Neither did I." They both laughed softly. It was a simple moment, but it felt like something they had lost was slowly returning. Not the old marriage. Something new. Something built on honesty instead of expectations. That night, after Liam fell asleep, Nathaniel and Emily sat together in silence. "Do you think people can really change?" Emily asked. Nathaniel looked toward their son. "I think people change when something matters enough." She smiled slightly. "And Liam matters enough?" Nathaniel looked at her. "More than anything." Emily understood then. Nathaniel was not the same man who left their marriage. He was still successful, still determined, still the same person in many ways. But now he understood what success could never teach him. A person's greatest achievement is not what they build for the world to see. It is what they protect when nobody else is watching. As time passed, Nathaniel Carter realized that rebuilding trust with Emily Richardson was not about one perfect conversation or one grand gesture. It was about hundreds of small moments that showed he was no longer the same person he used to be. Every morning, he chose to be present. Every evening, he chose to listen. And every day, he became more aware that the family he almost lost was the most valuable part of his life. Liam continued growing stronger, filling the quiet spaces in their home with new memories. Nathaniel experienced moments he never thought he would have. The first time Liam smiled at him. The first time he recognized his voice. The first time Nathaniel realized he was no longer just trying to become a better father. He already was one. Emily saw those moments too. She saw how carefully Nathaniel handled every responsibility. She saw how he celebrated the smallest progress. She saw how his priorities had changed without needing to announce it. One evening, while they sat together after Liam fell asleep, Emily looked at Nathaniel. "You know what surprises me the most?" she said. Nathaniel smiled. "What?" "You are not trying to convince anyone anymore." He looked at her thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" "Before, you always wanted people to see that you were successful, that you were capable, that you could handle everything." She paused. "Now you just are." Nathaniel understood what she meant. For years, he had spent so much energy proving himself that he forgot to simply exist with the people he loved. "I think I was afraid," he admitted. Emily looked surprised. "Afraid?" He nodded. "Afraid that if I stopped chasing success, I would lose everything." Emily looked at him gently. "And now?" Nathaniel looked toward Liam. "Now I know what I was actually afraid of losing." The honesty between them created something new. Not the same relationship they had before. Something stronger. Something built on understanding. Meanwhile, Nathaniel also began changing the way he led Carter Holdings. He introduced new policies that gave employees more balance between work and family. He encouraged leaders inside the company to remember that every employee was a person before they were a position. Some people questioned the changes at first. They wondered why a billionaire CEO would focus so much attention on personal matters. But Nathaniel knew the answer, because he had learned firsthand what happened when people ignored what truly mattered. One afternoon, Emily visited Carter Holdings with Liam. She watched Nathaniel interact with his employees. He greeted people personally. He remembered names. He asked about families. She smiled quietly because she realized something important. Nathaniel was not just changing for her. He was changing because he finally understood himself. Later, they walked together through the building hallway. Do you miss the old life? Emily asked. Nathaniel thought about it. Sometimes. She looked at him. Really? He nodded. I miss who we were before things became complicated. Emily smiled slightly. I miss that too. They stopped near a window overlooking the city. But I do not think we can go backward, Nathaniel said. Emily nodded. No, maybe we are not supposed to. Those words carried a quiet truth. Their goal was not to recreate the past. Their goal was to create something healthier. Something more honest. That evening, Nathaniel sat beside Liam's bed and watched his son sleep. Emily stood nearby. You know, she said softly. A year ago, I never imagined we would be here. Nathaniel smiled. Neither did I. Do you think everything happened for a reason? He looked at Liam before answering. I do not know. He paused. But I know I am grateful for where we are now. Emily smiled. There was no perfect ending. Life was still complicated. They still had challenges ahead. But they were no longer facing them separately. Nathaniel once believed a successful life was built through achievements, wealth, and recognition. Now he understood something much simpler. A meaningful life was built through the people you chose to show up for. And as he looked at Emily and Liam, he knew he had finally found the thing he spent years searching for. Not another achievement. Not another milestone. Home. Months after the day Nathaniel Carter first walked into the NICU, his life looked completely different. The world still knew him as the billionaire CEO of Carter Holdings. His company was still successful. His name still carried influence. But the person closest to him knew something the world did not. Nathaniel had changed. Not because he lost his ambition. Not because he stopped caring about success. He changed because he finally understood what success was supposed to protect. His family. Liam grew stronger every day, filling their home with moments Nathaniel once thought he would never experience. Morning smiles. Quiet evenings. Small discoveries that felt more valuable than any business achievement. Nathaniel saved every memory. Not in a company report. Not in a public announcement. In his heart. Emily Richardson noticed the difference too. She saw a man who was no longer trying to repair the past with promises. He was building the future through actions. One evening, Nathaniel and Emily sat together while Liam played nearby. The room was peaceful. Something that once felt impossible between them. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Nathaniel asked. Emily smiled softly. Sometimes. He looked down. I wish I had understood sooner. Emily knew what he meant. She also knew that regret alone was not enough. Maybe we were not ready back then, she said. Nathaniel looked at her. And now? She glanced toward Liam. Now we know what matters. Those words stayed with him. Their story was not about going back to the past. It was about becoming better people because of everything they had experienced. Nathaniel continued leading Carter Holdings, but his leadership changed. He created more programs to support families within the company. He encouraged employees to value their lives outside of work. He became the kind of leader he once needed himself. People around him noticed. The man who used to measure everything by achievement now measured success by impact. One afternoon, Nathaniel attended a company event where employees shared stories about how these changes affected their lives. He listened as people talked about having more time with their families, more confidence in pursuing their goals, and more support during difficult seasons. Nathaniel stood quietly, realizing something important. The company had grown because of financial decisions, but it had become meaningful because of human decisions. After the event, Emily joined him outside the building. The city lights surrounded them. You are proud of this, aren't you? She asked. Nathaniel smiled. Yes. She looked at him. The company? He shook his head. The people. Emily smiled because she understood. That was the difference between the old Nathaniel and the new one. Before, he wanted to build something impressive. Now, he wanted to build something meaningful. Later that night, Nathaniel sat beside Liam's bed and watched his son sleep. Emily stood nearby. You know, she said, when I first found out I was pregnant, I was scared. Nathaniel looked at her. I am sorry you went through that alone. Emily nodded. I know. There was no anger in her voice anymore. Only honesty. But I also think Liam brought something good into both of our lives. Nathaniel looked at his son. He did. A quiet moment passed. Then Nathaniel said something he had never said before. Thank you. Emily looked surprised. For what? For giving me a chance to be part of his life. She smiled gently. Thank you for choosing to stay. Those words meant everything. Because Nathaniel knew staying was the most important decision he had ever made. He had spent years building an empire that carried his name. But Liam would never care about the size of his company. Emily would never remember the awards on his walls. What they would remember was whether he was there, whether he listened, whether he loved them enough to choose them every day. And that became the greatest lesson Nathaniel Carter ever learned. A person can spend a lifetime searching for success, only to discover that the greatest achievement was waiting quietly at home all along. Not in a fortune, not in a title, but in the people who make life worth living.